Good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Lockwood, Director of EHS and ELA, and it's a great pleasure, as always, to welcome English Honour Society student members and chapter advisors to this very special webinar with Maggie Sheffer, award-winning author of The Man in the Banana Trees. Some very quick housekeeping notes for you. So tonight we are using StreamYard webinar technology, which you may not have come across before. In this platform, the chat function is available, but it's not going to be monitored by Maggie or by me, because quite frankly, we have other things to do right now. Maggie will be responding to a selection of questions that you submitted when you registered for this event. You are, though, more than welcome to use the chat function to share some feedback about tonight's discussion. Before the webinar begins, I'd like to thank Naaman Kent and Katie Murd, who are working behind the scenes to make sure this webinar is going to be a great success. So thank you to both of you. Tonight's interviewer is me, so no need for any further introduction there. And our speaker is Marguerite Sheffer. She's a New Orleans-based writer and professor of practice at Tulane University, where she teaches design thinking and speculative fiction as tools for social change. Her debut short stories collection, The Man in the Banana Trees, won the 2024 Iowa Short Fiction Award and was a finalist for the PEN America Robert W. Bingham Prize. I think it's great, but if you want a review from a better person than me, Maurice Carlos Ruffin called it a truly remarkable work of literary art. He will be speaking at our 2026 convention. And Claire Beam said it was a blaze of light in the literary world. And as many of you know, she was a speaker at our 2025 convention in Pittsburgh. A former high school English teacher in Oakland, Maggie is a founding member of several writing collectives, including Third Lantern Lit and the Brackish Artist Collective. She holds an MFA from Randolph and has received honours from the Adroit Journal, Glimmer Train, and the Chautauqua Janus Prize. She'll be a speaker at our 2026 Sigma Delta convention in New Orleans. So join us there to hear Maggie speak in person. Maggie, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm overjoyed to be here.
I think if you're okay, we'll just jump right in with the questions.
Sounds great to me.
Excellent, excellent. So our first one comes from Reagan Brunette in Florida and Rebecca Wilder in New Hampshire. They ask, what was the initial push that got you to write, and what has been your greatest inspiration?
I went to high school in New Hampshire, I have to say. So a lot of it in New Hampshire. My earliest push to write, I as long as I can remember, I've always been someone who loved both reading and writing stories. I think one of the earliest stories I wrote was in elementary school in 5th or 6th grade. About a planet full of dogs. and in high school, I have distinct memories of skipping class to go hang out in the library, which I do not advocate for, but I became an English teacher later in life, so it was kind of prescient of me. So yeah, it's kind of hard to answer the question because so much of my life is actually imaginary and in story form. I've always been that person who can be found reading a book or journaling or writing stories. And even when it's not convenient, story ideas will come to me. So that's not the hard part about writing. I do think some of my greatest inspiration comes from my time in classroom teaching. If you've read the stories in The Man in the Banana Trees, there's a lot of students and teachers in the book, and that's who the book is dedicated to, is my former teachers and students and colleagues, because I think teaching for me was just one of the most vulnerable, soul-bearing things I've ever done. It's such a unique relationship to have with other people. And that definitely made its way in both positive and scary ways into the stories that make up The Man in the Banana Trees. We have some really great teacher relationships in that book. And we have some really fraught, terrifying ones in the stories in the book. So that's something that, without really meaning to, I keep coming back to again and again.
Excellent. And Jacob Orter from Arizona sort of follows on with that and says, did your upbringing affect the way that you tell your stories? So we know what your inspiration is, but how you tell them, is that a product of nature versus nurture?
It's a great question. I think I have two answers to that question, or a two-part answer. One is that I was an Air Force brat growing up, so I moved around a lot. So reinvention of myself and my world was something I had to get used to and adapt to do. And I think, I don't know if it's a direct line to the short story form, but I think reinvention is something I'm really interested in, and playfulness and experimentation, and not just trying to write a quote unquote good story, but to to reinvent and to play with the boundaries of what a story is can be is something that's always fascinated me. The second part of that answer is that I was very lucky to grow up in a house where my mom loved fantasy and sci-fi and took both of those things very, very seriously. So she handed me her copy of the Narnia books by C.S. Lewis. She handed me very early her copies of the Wrinkle in Time series by Madeleine L'Engle and so many other books. Star Wars, huge Star Wars fan. So the how, I think, genre has always been really interesting to me and second nature. And I get asked a lot why I write genre fiction. And it's, again, a hard question to answer because that's what I was brought up on. That, to me, is what I've always loved. Those stories of other worlds and planets and magical creatures has always been a comfort to me. And I was very lucky to have a mom who took that very seriously. Like, it wasn't seen as being just jokes and games. It was seen as being very important moral, material.
And do you have a favorite sci-fi or fantasy book?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I love the Expanse series that's out right now. I love Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. I'm actually going to reread it very soon for the third or fourth time, and it's like a 500-page book, so it's an endeavor. Anne Leckie is an amazing science fiction writer. Ancillary Justice is the name of her book that won the Hugo, I think. Yep. And then Arkady Martine, what's the name of that book? I'm going to have to find it for you later, but Arkady Martine is worth checking out. Amazing sci-fi writer. But I think the thing all these authors have in common is that they're writing these tales of adventure and swashbuckling and travel, but they also have deep moral and kind of geopolitical implications too, which I think sci-fi is really good at.
Excellent. So you told us a little bit about your childhood, growing up, moving around. What was your path from graduating university, let's say, through to being a successful writer? And that question comes from Stephanie Hickman, who's also in New Hampshire.
Oh, hi. Hey, New Hampshire again. My path was long and indirect and full of twists and turns. It was not a straight upward line. I mentioned that I always loved reading and writing, and that has always been true, but it certainly was not a straight line into literary success, which is a mantle I'm still having trouble claiming. I did study creative writing at college. I went to Barnard College and I had some amazing professors there. And I also took some teacher education classes there. And those two things were my passions, teaching and writing. And to be honest, I remember really loving my creative writing classes in college and being lucky that I had a professor who said to us, take some time before you go jump to an MFA program or try to publish your great work. Because the stories we were writing at that point, many of them were very crafty and technically strong, but they were about our study abroads or our limited, many of us had not had life experiences at that point. I certainly hadn't. I don't think that's true for everyone, but I was not ready to sit down and write the stories that I wanted to write. I just needed to live more. And also, I really loved teaching. So I pursued teaching, taught for about 10 years, loved teaching, found it very creatively fulfilling and also very creatively draining at the same time. So even though I'd always hoped to write in the summers, that sounds so plausible, it never really worked out for me. I know some teachers who did not work out for me. But then when I left the classroom after about 10 years, COVID also happened. So I really only started writing seriously again in 2020. And I applied to an MFA program. I attended the Randolph low residency MFA program, which, if you're unfamiliar, is a program that you don't move to and attend full time. But it was one that let me keep a full-time job, keep my house with a mortgage, keep my family relationships, and only travel once or twice a year and attend virtually. And that for me was perfect. It was just the kick in the butt I needed. And I loved it. I thrived there. So all the stories in The Man in the Banana Trees and the first draft of my novel, I kind of just had this explosive period of writing from 2020 to now, where I've been balancing a full-time job and family life and all that stuff, but also really plugging into this creative side of myself. And then the success part is a funny question. The only other thing I'll add is that my path has been full of rejection, which I just want to share is such a normal part of when you start sending your writing out in the world. The stories in The Man of the Banana Trees, which I'm enormously proud of, have been rejected over 500 times in total, including a great handful of rejections that came after the collection was accepted for publication and won the award. So I think one thing I always want to be transparent about is that is not a bad sign. If you're sending work out and getting rejected, it is just a natural sign. And all those stories did find very great homes in wonderful literary journals and magazines that I'm enormously thrilled about. But to get there, they had to rack up 20, 30 rejections. So I had to be the believer in the stories before anyone else was telling me, like, yes, you're onto something.
And this is a common theme from all of our webinar speakers.
Yeah.
The same thing. The rejection process is daunting. I mean, nobody likes getting a rejection, right? But eventually, the stories will go to the right place, the place that they're destined for.
Yes, and I have some wonderful rejections I have pinned to my desk that are the like, not quite, or send us your next one from some dream publications like Conjunctions or Uncanny. And even though they're rejections, they were so heartening as a new writer to just know that someone saw something in them, even if they weren't going to quite publish them yet.
Right. So what inspired you to bring all these stories together to form the Man in the Banana Trees as a collection?
Yeah.
And what inspired those stories in particular? So that's sorry, Maggie. That question, before I forget, that question because I'm at Eva Kelly in Pennsylvania and Jack Phillips in Alabama. Sorry.
Thank you for the great question. Different writers would have very different answers to this question, but for me, I actually was not thinking of them as a collection. I was writing them each as totally individual stories. And for me, that was really freeing. I was writing these stories while attending my MFA program. And my goal at the time was really to finish a short story for the first time in my life, to learn how to write a short story, to have a good ending and to be really satisfied. Because I had never published anything before and only had one story that maybe had an ending at all at the time I started writing these stories. And I think approaching it in this playful attitude, in this experimental, like kind of, I want to see what I can get away with. I want to see what can be done. Took a lot of the pressure off of me. I was not writing with a book in mind. I was not writing with publication really in mind. That came way later. And I think I saw the stories as totally disconnected. But at the moment when I learned the Iowa Short Fiction Award existed and I was putting them together, I did begin to realize there are some themes that repeat and obsessions that repeat and some tics, of course, that repeat as a writer and some voice elements that I think repeat in a healthy way. So for me, it was almost subconscious that they feel connected as a whole, but they are a snapshot of a certain time in my life when I was going through some grieving, when I was going through some hard moments, and also when I was kind of reinventing myself into this writer. I think a lot of the stories have to do with art and creation and who owns art or what art is for. And it's interesting to me that I was writing them right at that time when I was like saying, yes, I want writing to be a part of my life. I'm committing to this both financially and with my calendar. So yeah, reflecting back is crazy because at the time I did not know what was happening. I was just writing.
Right. And, you mentioned your calendar there. Nicole Nettleton in New Hampshire and Sean Brossard in New Jersey can you tell us a little bit more about how you plan your work? What is your plan? What does your work plan look like? And do you teach design thinking? Do you bring in elements of design thinking into that planning and writing process?
Yeah. So both the schedule and the design thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So to the schedule part, at the time I was writing these stories, I was carving out time wherever I could because I did have a full-time job. And then for a large part, my daughter was born while I was finalizing a lot of the stories, my first child. So I was writing from 5 to 7 a.m. a lot of days when I could wake up early enough and do a little bit of reading and writing. I was often writing on my lunch break. I was meeting on Zoom with my writing group, who I'm sure I'll share more about later. They're phenomenal, but I was meeting with them, after our kids were put to bed on Zoom. So really carving out time where I could and getting used to really small increments of time. If I could get a few hours, that would be very luxurious. But most days it was like an hour to 15 minutes, some days even. So just really, it didn't always feel great, but there were definitely some days when my writing time was like 5 or 6 sentences to just chip away at it. But I did always feel that satisfaction that having written something felt better and made me feel happier and kept it alive in the back of my brain in a way that was really productive than waiting for the perfect amount of time or the perfect block on my calendar. And then I think that does relate to how design thinking plays in. I think one thing design thinking has taught me is that if I plan the process carefully of writing, it lets me give up planning the content and the craft, lets me surrender a bit of control in that way. So I don't hold on to this idealized version of the story in my head. Instead, I'm kind of learning by doing, which is a big design thinking tenet, and just starting, embracing the shit rough draft. I do a lot of listing, especially when I feel stuck, which doesn't often feel like writing, but helps me kind of progress and focus on the ideas. And I think a big tenet of design thinking too is that people think creativity is having better ideas, but actually many studies show that creativity comes from a higher tolerance for bad ideas and just kind of wading through that period where it feels like you don't know what you're doing, but pushing forward anyway and keeping listing ideas, keeping throwing stuff out there. And I relate to that a lot with writing. I write many, many drafts of my stories. I think my average is somewhere around 25 to 30 drafts before I feel something is done. And those are true drafts, not like tinkering at the word level, but really rehauling it. And the stories, I think, are not good for most of that time. So it's really just continuing to work and experiment and play with them for a very long time, rather than waiting for genius to strike and feeling really confident. I rarely feel confident, but I feel like I'm enjoying the act of messing around with the pieces.
So what do you do when you have a story that maybe feels stuck, or you're not sure how to sort of move it forward? I mean, how do you deal with the writer's block that might come up?
I pride myself that I often feel stuck, but I have a lot of tools to try something. So I think feeling stuck is totally natural. I often don't know what to do. But some strategies I will try in that case. Well, one is to put the story in a drawer for a very long time, often months at a time, and just wait until I will have fresh eyes again and go work on something else for a while. Another, as I mentioned, is listing. One of my very favorite strategies when I'm feeling stuck is to do a 25 things list, meaning if I don't know how to open a story, list 25 possible ways it could open. And many of them are truly bad ideas, but usually around number 20 or 25, I hit something that resonates or something becomes unlocked, and just forcing myself to stop. And rather than waiting for the one good idea, just like jot down things, that really helps. And then my writing group, I'm going to talk about them a lot. I write regularly with 2 different writing groups, and having someone else's eyes on my work, even when it doesn't feel done, which I know can be controversial for writers. I like sharing unfinished or early drafts with trusted readers who I think are really generous and smart. That often gets me unstuck. Just seeing what someone else is noticing about it or what they think I'm writing towards can be really revealing.
Excellent. So that question came from Alessandra Moni in Guatemala and Gracie Liebesfeld in New York. So specifically about the Man in the Banana Trees, Dylan Marcotte in Illinois and Azul Perez in Mexico say that they love how each element was balanced throughout the short stories, if it's loss or art or the ownership of art. But did you ever worry about overloading one element more than others? And did you feel that each element in your stories has its own moment in its own sort of natural, organic way?
Well, thank you, Dylan, for the compliment and the great question. It's such an interesting one. When I'm drafting, I try to just be very loose and have no concerns at all, as if I'm writing just for me. So I will say that doesn't come up for me in early drafts, but certainly in revision, I might worry about one element overpowering something or one emotional beat just being too much or too deadening to the story. You mentioned loss. Yeah, that was a big one for this book in particular. I was obviously writing about loss, but I did not want to be writing a downer of a book or a story where it just feels one note. Because that's also not what loss really feels like to me. It wouldn't be realistic. And I think for me, that's where the act of writing and the push to be as specific as possible comes in, because I think grief in the abstract can be really melodramatic or easy to turn away from. But I think when you really get into some of those honest specifics, it can be funny and it can be loving and it can be surprising. It can be scary. It can be all these other emotions too. So I think leaning hard into the specifics and the idiosyncrasies and the weird stuff and genre as one way to do that, to describe not just what actually happened, but what it felt like by adding a magical element or a science fictional element. You can sometimes more, in my experience, more accurately capture what these human experiences feel like by using elements of the unreal. So I think that was one way that I kept those emotions that might be bogging me down, but I was able to refreshen them or to revisit them in new and interesting ways. I will say too, one reason it takes me so long to finish a short story, many of these stories took years working on them on and off. And I think your question about the elements, Dylan, is right on, because as an example, there's a story in the collection called The Estate of Miriam Ackerman, or In the Style of Miriam Ackerman. I used the old title there for a second. And that story took years because for so long it was a story about a potter, and that was it. And I didn't have the other elements that make up the story, the photography and the AI that is in the story. They just hadn't come up, but I was sitting on this story. I kind of had the bones of it. And then I encountered the photography of Vivian Maier and the life story of Vivian Maier, which became a big part of that story. And then I read an article about AI used to kind of add on to people's art, and that became a big part of a story. So for me, sometimes time and just knowing that there's a missing secret ingredient and keeping my antenna out in the world can really help add that little special something. So it's not just a story about X, but it's a story about X, Y, and Z. Hope that makes sense.
Right, absolutely. I think that leads into really well into our sort of next question, which is from Katie Robbins in North Carolina. And she says, was there a specific event in your life that inspired you to consider literature as a method for social change?
That's a great question. I think, again, teaching at the high school level is such a formative experience for me, because you can both see how wonderful youth are and how full of promise they are, and how we're under delivering on our promise to help them succeed in the world. I think, especially, I was working at some pretty under-resourced schools in Oakland, California, and New Orleans. And I was working alongside dedicated teachers, and I was working with incredible students. And I think the amount which my students always deserved more than we could provide was really an electrifying, radicalizing experience for me. As someone who went in pretty radical, it was still radicalizing. And it's something I don't want to ever stop talking about or thinking about. So I think that's a big way that it affected me. I also think a lot that, how to put this? I think that most stories are about change. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, stories are great tools for dealing with complexity and dealing with things that aren't easy to talk about or think about and the futures we want to see. So I think my favorite stories always have some element of a moral question or a moral dilemma or a social bent,
Right.
even if it's a backstory or maybe not the main plot line, but they're always aware of the world we live in.
So would you say then, Maggie, that your stories grow from an initial desire to see change?
Grow from anger.
Okay.
I'm often frustrated. I stay up late at night worrying. I'm fuming currently about a lot of things. And writing stories is a way to lean into that dissatisfaction, I think, and say, this is not okay. It should be otherwise. We deserve more as a society and as a people. And also the ways in which we're complicit in a lot of these things. That's a big theme of the stories in the collection. It's not just saying it should be otherwise, but that many of the characters are complicit in that world that they want to change, and they have to acknowledge that to keep going. And again, I think stories, and there's a reason I'm not an essay writer. I often don't have a thesis about what should happen, but I have a lot of feelings. And I really like that stories let me lean into the feelings and the complexity and not say, well, here's the single right answer, but here's 25 questions. Here's a billion things to think about. Here's all the ins and outs in its full complexity, and not settle for easy answers, but also not say it's okay to avoid the questions.
Right. So Corliss Cranwell in Florida asks, how do you manage to stay focused on the writing when there's so much chaos going on in the world right now?
Yeah, that is such a great question. I relate to that a lot. It's not always easy, but I do a lot of journaling, which often leads into a story idea or something. But for me, I do think that personally, writing is the way I process the world. And a lot of my writing about the world will never be published. But I feel these big feelings, and writing for me is a way to help maybe not make sense of them, but to wade through when things just don't make sense and to start to put names to things. I mentioned I have a daughter. She's 3 years old now, and she's entered this stage where all these things and these big emotions are happening to her. And then she'll come home to her dolls and be like, and then they said this, and then they said this. And that's what I do as well in my days, is the things that I'm trying to make sense of. I replay as stories and I replay with the dolls in my head. And it's just so fascinating to watch her do this, because there is so much I feel and think about the world. And for me, stories are the way that I can begin to understand and participate in the world. And I also think Ursula Le Guin has a great essay about escapism that I think is really important to think about. It might be a speech she made, but I think reading and writing can be seen as escapism. And I think I love her writing on this subject, because she reframes it as, when you're in a bad situation, you're a captured soldier or a prisoner, your duty is to escape and to take as many people with you as you can. And escapism and imagining the world otherwise is not a negative thing. It might be our duty, actually.
Right. And so when you finished, or when you're writing, or maybe have finished writing a story, whose critique or advice do you value most when you're going through that and making the edits? And this is the moment to talk about your writing group. So that question's from Suli Oliveira in New York.
Thank you for the question, Suli. Yeah, I've been waiting for this one. I love talking about my writing group. I would not be the writer I am without them at all. So 2 writers for my MFA program, Corinne Cordasco-Pack and Tierney Oberhammer, and we call ourselves the Wildcat Writing Group. We exchange work very frequently. We have a Slack going on. We're like always talking about writing. And I think for me, writing with them, writing for an audience initially who's so smart and interesting and curious and good-hearted, it helps me elevate my own fiction, because I'm never dumbing anything down. I'm always writing for my ideal readers, and they're actually going to read it very soon. So I'm always trying to surprise them or thrill them, and I'm always excited to read their work too. So I think my writing is so elevated by having their eyes on it, both in terms of their feedback, but also because I'm writing it for them first. I also write with a writer, Amy Johnson, who writes speculative fiction, who I read online. But I think what I do is we exchange work super, super frequently and try to do what we call generative feedback rather than critique, at least at first, which means really trying to say, not is the work ready to be published, but more like, what's really going on here? Approaching it with a sense of curiosity and what it could be, and trying to keep it loose and playful as long as possible. And then only near the very, very end saying like, okay, let's do a line edit. Let's like help each other polish it for publication. But I think one thing I've learned about my process is that if someone critiques me too early, it really deadens the piece. If they're trying to find flaws in it or trying to make it match some idea of good writing that we have out in the world. But if they're approaching it from the same sense of play and experimentation and like, what are you really writing about? What's really going on here? Then I just get so excited and jazzed, and it makes me braver as a writer. So a lot of the things we do as a writing group are to try to figure out that question, like what makes us braver as writers? What would we do if we weren't afraid?
And do you find that you all write at the same speed? Would you say you're a quicker writer than they are, or they are quicker than you? Does it change depending on what each individual is writing at a particular time?
You're right, it changes. And it also changes based on life circumstance. We all have, jobs and families and other obligations. So sometimes one person's able to just got back from a writing retreat, etc. But I do think that having a regular thing on the calendar as often as we can really helps with that peer accountability. So having someone who's waiting to receive my draft makes me put the idea down on paper when I might just have it wafting in my head. And that's invaluable, to get the idea down, make it tangible, so then I can start making it better.
Right, I agree. I think having that deadline, that's a bit of pressure. I mean, I work in the same way. If I have a deadline to work to, I will make sure everything's done before the deadline. It'll be done perfectly. But if I don't have a deadline, there's an excuse to be like, tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow. Yeah, exactly. Then tomorrow comes and I'll do it tomorrow again. And you go around in a circle. But I think you're absolutely right. Having the bit of the pressure, low level pressure, but having some pressure helps. And then I think our last question. This is actually an interesting one, and this is an unusual question, perhaps. It's from Jose Daniel Maldonado in Guatemala, and he says, "What did it feel like when you saw your book in print for the first time?" We've talked today about the stories from idea point, putting together, getting into a collection. But when you saw the book, when it arrived, when that advanced copy arrived on your doorstep, what did it feel like?
Ooh, Jose, I love this question. It felt unabashedly awesome. I am so proud and happy about it. Jose, I hope you get to do this too. And I hope everyone listening gets this feeling of holding the book you've written in your hands. I've always coveted books. I love touching them. I love a library. I love, holding them. And I love the cover of my book. I'm enormously happy with how it came out. And I still can't quite believe it's real. Like sometimes I'll go pet them just through them. My husband will make fun of me because he's like, "You wrote that book. Why are you reading it?" But I'll just open to a page just to remind myself it's real, because it has been a dream for so long. It doesn't feel real that it's an object that I can hand to someone and they can pick it up and have this kind of intimate view of the weirdest corners of my mind. That's such a wild privilege to have. And I want to do it again.
So can you let us into any secrets about what's coming?
Oh, sure. The timeline is secret to me too. But I am working on a novel that could take, I'm a very slow, meticulous isn't the word. I'm a very slow, messy writer. So it might take many years, but I'm revising a novel and I'm on draft 7 right now. And its tentative title is called Egret. And what I'll share about it is that it is historical speculative fiction. So it's both set in the past and has some magic. There's a magical hot sauce involved. That's what I'll share.
Oh, we look forward to that. We're looking forward to that, Maggie. Thank you so much, Maggie, for answering all our questions. It's been great to hear you talk about what you do and how you do it. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to everyone who has attended this evening and for sending your questions for this interview. If you would like to watch this interview again, it will be available on the Sigma Tau Delta YouTube channel. That's at Sigma Tau Delta English. If you click the little bell button to subscribe, you get to receive updates and interesting video content from us. If you'd like to purchase The Man in the Banana Trees, please feel free to do so via the English Honor Society's bookshop page. All the purchases there support independent writers and independent bookstores. As I said at the beginning, Maggie will be speaking at our 2026 convention in New Orleans, so look out for more information about that. The dates, you can get them in your calendar right now, are March 29 through April 1st, 2026. And next up for our webinar on October 8th is Angie Cruz, and then she's followed by Gabrielle Zevin, author of Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. And then finally, at the end of the semester in November, Pulitzer Prize winner James I. James. So we look forward to seeing you all there. Have a wonderful evening and good night.